The following audio recording has been designed for learning purposes only. Do not share, distribute, or provide any type of copies, or this audio lesson will not be made available to you. Good luck with today's lesson.
And then I'm going to talk about, we're going to see a short film that kind of reiterates a lot of things that I've been talking about in the last few class periods. And then I'm going to talk about the Gilded Age and how the 1% lived during the Gilded Age, this time of when all this amazing wealth was being created and there was no federal income tax, and so these robber barons could live better than any kings ever lived. Oh, and there's an issue with the water. So I was upstairs and it was coming out rusty. So I don't know if it's coming out in drinking fountains, but I would just avoid the drinking fountains. So I notified the administration, so I don't know what's going on. So if I think I ended. Did we cover the Pullman strike and the Homestead strike? Yeah. So we're all through that. And so we only have a few more slides to go. All right, so but I'm not sure that I got into the Panic of 1893. I think we might have just ended. I did? Okay, sorry. Yep. So, J.P. Morgan, yeah. Coxey's Army, maybe we didn't see. We did? Yeah. Okay. You guys are ahead of everyone then. Currency question. Oh, did we finish? Wait, McKinley wins? Oh, then we did all that. But we didn't see the film yet, right? All right. Okay. Yeah. Okay, good. It is a crash course in the World's Fair. Well, that's how the survey classes are, though. It's a crash course in all these topics. And then if you decide to take higher level classes, you study them much more in depth. Like the Civil War, when I say that, I mean that was weeks of the Civil War and memorizing battle movements even. All right, so that's good. Okay, so what we're going to see first then is the, this is from the Biography of America. It's a series that was done by the Annenberg Foundation several years ago, and it's sort of a little bit of a review of primarily chapter 17. And so it has lots of good images, bit more in-depth information as well about what I've been talking about. So we'll do this, and then I'll be moving on to the mansions of the Gilded Age.
The end of the 19th century, American cities come of age. The reigning question at the time was, can these cities be controlled? Are they out of
of dial-up, practically.
Are they growing in such a way that they're creating problems that will bring down the country? Chicago, rising triumphant from the ashes of the Great Fire, the city of the century. I mean, they are, what I said before, great opportunity centers, but within the cities there's this hurrying and constant social process that no one knows how to control. And these are places with tremendous creativity and tremendous volatility, and I think they represent what the 19th century is all about, as a time of crisis but also opportunity. Today, on a biography of America, the new city. In the summer of 1893, Chicago put on one of the spectacles of the century, the World's Columbian Exposition. It was a fair to celebrate 1 year late, the 400th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of the New World. And it drew 27 million people from every part of the globe. The fair marked America's emergence from the Civil War as a reunified nation of unrivaled power and prosperity. The imperial architecture of the exhibit buildings and her impressive displays of new science and invention announced that the approaching century would be the American century. But if this was America's fair, it was even more so Chicago's, a declaration that it had arrived as a city of global consequence. In 1830, there was no Chicago. 60 years later, it was the second largest city in America. And amazingly, in between these years, in 1871, it was almost totally destroyed by a colossal firestorm. To make the fair truly spectacular, Chicago's master builder, Daniel Burnham, constructed a miniature city of gleaming white buildings on former swampland along Lake Michigan. The buildings looked like those of ancient Rome, but the white city had an ultra-modern infrastructure, including the most advanced urban transit system in the world. And the grounds were magnificently landscaped by Frederick Law Olmsted, designer of New York Central Park. It was to be a vision of the urban future, but many Chicagoans saw their own city of smoke and steel as a true model of the new kind of metropolis. Chicago was loud and dirty, but full of energy and modern advancements, and Chicagoans wanted the world to see it. The 19th century was the age of cities. In 1860, only 1 American in 6 lived in a city. By 1900, 1 in 3 did. And no city had grown faster or was more representative of the age than Chicago. Chicago had won the right to hold a fair in a bitter competition with New York that was decided in Congress. The Windy City's lobbyists convinced Congress that Chicago should be awarded the fair because it, not New York, was the most American of the country's largest cities. Like America itself, Chicago was young and aggressively confident, a product of both frontier and technological expansion, a place of hustlers and visionaries, disdainful of tradition and committed to the future. It was a place that did things on a big scale, rising bigger and better in a mere 10 years from the ashes of the Great Fire of 1871. Chicago was the queen city of the machine age. Its vast slaughtering mills and mail-order houses were the incarnation of speed and efficiency. And its rebuilt downtown was a technological wonder, with streets lit by electricity, serviced by rapid-running streetcars, and lined by solid rows of office skyscrapers. New York built the world's first skyscrapers in the 1870s, but by the 1880s, Chicago had more of them, and they were built with greater technical audacity than New York's, making Chicago the world's first vertical city. This prairie colossus was a foretaste of the future in another way. In 1893, it was laid out like no other city on earth, yet soon all big industrial cities would look like it. It was at the same time a vertical and a horizontal city, a city of steel-framed skyscrapers ringed by suburbs linked to the downtown by steel rails. The skyscraper was a completely American and a completely commercial creation. No other country built skyscrapers, and there were no skyscrapers that were not office buildings. Chicago's architecture mirrored the character of the place, a city built for business. After visiting Chicago, a New York writer thought it curious that the image of the downtown that remained fixed in his mind was made up exclusively of business buildings. As he wrote, "Not a church enters into it, scarcely a public building enters into it." Every age brings forth cities that embody the spirit of its time. Industrial America, the land of the dollar, it was Chicago. As a French writer remarked, in New York, business is the big word. In Chicago, it is the God, the last reason for every action and thought. Most visitors were unprepared for Chicago. It was that spectacular and awful. Steaming toward the heart of Chicago in one of the country's new express trains, tourists passed through an industrial amphitheater, bigger and blacker than Pittsburgh, endless reaches of factories and freight yards, and slag heaps and coal piles that looked like small mountains, and everywhere, covering everything, were wind-driven clouds of black and gray smoke. Walking out of one of Chicago's cavernous train stations, strangers entered the busiest and noisiest downtown in the world, a place that 20 years before was a cemetery of fallen, fire-scorched buildings. Visitors were overwhelmed by the velocity of Chicago because so much of its commercial energy was confined to a 1 square kilometer loop, named for the iron ring of transit lines that circled it. The terrific crowding and noise there was shocking even to New Yorkers, whose city's commercial activity was strung out for miles along its lengthy avenues. They called Chicago the city of speed. Cable cars pushing through heavy traffic slammed into slow-moving drays, lifting them into the air and overturning wagons and teams. Signs hanging over office doors read, "Away for lunch, back in 5 minutes." And the movement of the crowds on the streets reminded one tourist of an infantry attack. Everything in the loop was organized for the efficient conduct of capitalist enterprise. Cable cars and electric trolleys brought shoppers from the city's far-flung suburbs right to the doors of State Street department stores. And in skyscraper offices, rows of women typists performed clerical work faster than had ever been done before, their rapid-moving fingers connected to their machines as if they were physical parts of them. The typewriter brought women workers into the capitalist office space and made office work more specialized and mind-numbing, like factory work in Armour's meat mills. Factories in the sky. That's what the skyscrapers were for the new and growing female workforce. Yet these vertically organized buildings were marvelously convenient ways to do business. Within a single tall building with its array of legal, advertising, and commercial services, world-shaping deals were made in a matter of minutes to the amazement of European businessmen. The skyscraper was also a technological wonder. The first skyscrapers in New York and Chicago were built with traditional construction techniques. They were supported by heavy masonry walls, which were especially thick at the base. Window space was at a premium, and no one dared build a wall-bearing building over 10 stories. It would have collapsed in a heap. Then, in the mid-'80s, Chicago architects, following the lead of William LeBaron Jenney, began building skyscrapers supported by wind-braced iron and steel frames, or cages as they were called. The thin walls of brick and terracotta, lined with long rows of windows, were not part of the building's support system. The steel frame did all the work. The wall was a mere curtain. Chicago's skyscrapers evoked the no-nonsense business style of the city. They were clean, featured buildings with a minimum of surface decoration. That's what made them distinctive, a truly American architecture. They looked like what they were supposed to be, business buildings, while New York skyscrapers looked like Greek temples or Roman baths. Chicago's skyscrapers looked this way because they were built by developers interested in cutting costs, not showing off. Louis Sullivan, the first architect to make tall buildings beautiful, argued that form must follow function, but in Chicago, form usually followed finance. The skyscraper was the first building in history to depend on machines for its operation. It needed elevators to carry passengers to its upper floors, and telephone and telegraph systems to put tenants in the air in touch with the city below. The skyscraper couldn't have existed without another gigantic machine, an urban transit system capable of moving its small army of workers in and out of the city.
These photographs of the city with all those power lines everywhere, it was horribly dangerous too. It was said that there would be arcs of electricity that just randomly would like shoot out from the lines and electrocute people.
Another great commercial invention of the age, the department store, with its even larger army of sales clerks and customers. The department stores of America's big cities were crowded from morning till night with customers, as many as 250,000 a day, and some of them had workforces larger than steel mills. Marshall Field, who rose from stock boy to the richest man in Chicago, built the country's most opulent department store, a palace of desire that catered almost exclusively to women. In the department stores along State Street, women accounted for 99% of the purchases. When Chicago lit its department stores with electricity, many of these women shoppers stayed in town into the evening without male escorts. Traditionalists complained about this, and also about what they called the new vice of shopping. A cranky editorial in the New York Times called shopping a purse-destroying addiction, every bit as bad as male drinking. Yet the accepted place of Victorian women in a male-dominated society, in the home all day, taking care of children, sewing, cleaning, cooking, and entertaining, made shopping a liberating escape from domestic drudgery. In the great Chicago novel, Sister Carrie, Indiana-born Theodore Dreiser captures this oncoming consumption culture. Carrie Meeber, his central character, leaves her home in rural Wisconsin at age 18, drawn to the lights of Chicago as young Dreiser had been, like a moth to a flame. There, she enters a glittering department store and finds herself wanting things she's never seen before, the very moment she sets eyes on them. There is also in Sister Carrie a brilliant sensitivity to the changing nature of dress as an indicator of class and social station. A salesgirl at Marshall Field's making $6 a week could save her money and buy one or two ready-to-wear outfits that could instantly place her on a level with her middle-class customers. In the city, it was possible to move up in life simply by buying the right clothes, or as Carrie does, by having her lover buy them for her. Listen to Dreiser. When a girl leaves her home at 18 for the city, she does one of two things. Either she falls into saving hands and becomes better, or she rapidly assumes the cosmopolitan standard of virtue and becomes worse. Here Dreiser describes how many Americans felt about cities then as well as now. There was the enticement of a better life, but the equal threat of moral corruption. In Chicago, moving up in life usually meant moving outward, that is, to the suburbs. We think of suburbia as a 20th century creation, but the suburbs, like the central business district, came into being at the end of the 19th century, both of them made possible by mass transportation. Before 1800, Chicago had a transit system dependent on 75,000 horses. Teams of them pulled passenger cars along tracks in the streets. The horse, like the modern automobile, was a heavy noise and air polluter. When it rained, the city's gutters flowed rank-smelling brown streams. In dry weather, pulverized manure blew into the faces of downtown shoppers. The constant drumming sound of iron-shod hooves on the city streets was deafening, and as many as 10,000 dead horses a year had to be removed from the city streets, where they'd been left to swell and rot in the gutters. In 1880,
it was very common to find women selling flowers from little stands and baskets on the corners of American streets at that time, or European streets for that matter, because if you were out on the street, people would buy little bouquets of flowers called nosegays, and people would put them in their noses to try to cover up the horrible smells. And women used to carry little vials of what was called smelling salts, often just a little vial that might be in a bracelet or in a necklace that they would have around their neck, and they would smell it every once in a while to keep from passing out from the horrible stench.
The cable car, a San Francisco invention, began to replace the horse as a passenger conveyance in Chicago. It was twice as fast as a horse and was clean and relatively quiet. But just as cable cars were being extended, the electric trolley came along. It was faster, quieter, and less expensive to install than a steam-driven cable system. By 1900, almost every American city had adopted the trolley. In the Gilded Age, urban transit was owned and operated not as today by municipalities, but by powerful and power-hungry capitalists. The transit czar of Chicago was an ex-convict named Charles Yerkes, who Dreiser made into the central character of his novel, The Titan. Yerkes had served jail time in Philadelphia for stock fraud, and he led a scandalous lifestyle with half a dozen mistresses. He'd come to Chicago, he brazenly announced, for one reason only, to make a fortune. Employing corruption and fraud on a colossal scale, they called him the Goliath of Graft. Yerkes built a far-flung transit system. In the process, he made $1 million in land speculation. Yerkes built tracks out to empty land on the edge of the city, land he'd secretly bought in advance for a song. Then, when his transit lines were in place, he made a killing selling it to housing contractors. But Yerkes couldn't get along without a little help from his friends. He needed franchises from the city to operate his transit lines on public streets, and to get them, he bribed almost the entire city council. He was finally driven out of Chicago after he tried to muscle through legislation that would have given him a long-term monopoly of Chicago's transit system. Yerkes returned to New York and then went abroad to build the London Underground. Chicago was glad to get rid of him, but he left behind one of the finest urban transportation systems in the world. In joining town and country, Yerkes helped bring into existence something entirely new and now long forgotten, the streetcar city. The streetcar city altered the social landscape of the American city. Since the time cities were first built in America, the rich and powerful lived in the center and the poor and powerless on the periphery. That's the way it had been in cities all over the world for thousands of years. In America, two things combined to change this: the streetcar and an increasing desire of upward-bound people to escape the city. The catalyst for it all was immigration. European immigrants fleeing poverty and persecution had been pouring into American cities since the early 1800s. In Chicago, first it was the Germans and the Irish. Then, toward the end of the century, tremendous numbers of Southern and Eastern Europeans, Italians, Poles, Slovaks, and Russian Jews. Many of these immigrants joined labor unions and radical political parties, and their politics, their poverty, their alien religion and language deeply frightened older, predominantly Protestant city dwellers. Earlier in the century, the rich and middle class had no choice but to remain in town, close to their work. But cable cars and trolleys allowed them to escape to the borders of the city, yet remain a short streetcar ride away from work, and from theaters, department stores, circuses, baseball parks, and all the myriad wonders of the Victorian city. Thus began the greatest internal migration in the history of cities, the exodus to the suburbs. Soon, even the better paid working class headed for the booming subdivisions. Older immigrants, as always was the American practice, running away from newer ones. In this way, the streetcar turned the American city inside out, shifting the center of population and prestige from the center to the edge. That's why American cities today are different from the cities of continental Europe, where the well-to-do continue to live in the urban core and great numbers of the poor reside in the suburbs. In the 20th century, urban sprawl would lead to the abandonment of the city as both people and jobs headed for the borderlands. But at the end of the 19th century, city and suburb complemented one another as cities became, at the same time, more centralized and dispersed. With jobs and so many attractions downtown a nickel ride away, nobody worried about the suburbs killing the city. In their constant movement in and out of the central city, the middle class rarely came into contact with the poor. This was a divided city. Chicago's worst slum, Packingtown, was located far to the south of the downtown, but most of the city's ethnic ghettos were close to the downtown, yet hidden from it by a belt of industry. In the Jewish quarter, multi-story tenements served extra duty as small factories or sweatshops, as they were called. Here, men, women, and children labored up to 16 hours a day in their gloomy apartments, making the inexpensive dresses that gave instant status to those Marshall Field shop girls. Sickness was rampant in these unheated, unventilated places. Smallpox, cholera, consumption, tuberculosis, and scarlet fever. Milk, Arriving in unrefrigerated wagons was often dangerously spoiled. So mothers gave their children beer from the local saloon, which at least was pasteurized. Were these conditions untypical? Well, in 1900, almost 400,000 Chicagoans in a city of 1.7 million lived in squalor. Government turned a blind eye to these problems until reformers began to push and prod. In 1889, a young, partially crippled woman from rural Illinois arrived in Chicago and established Hull House, one of the country's first settlement houses. Her name was Jane Addams. Addams turned a rundown mansion in an Italian slum into a refuge for neighborhood women and their children. She set up a daycare center, a playground, a gymnasium, and a bathhouse, along with a reading club. And she put reproductions of great works of art on the walls to bring some refinement into the lives of her new neighbors. Addams tried to Americanize these people, urging them to shed their old world customs for middle-class ways. Her smothering paternalism alienated some immigrants, but she began to change, thanks to the influence of Florence Kelley. Kelley arrived at Hull House with her 3 young children in 1891, fleeing an abusive husband. A fiery socialist, she laughed at Hull House's decorous tea parties and art receptions and challenged Addams to alter the direction the settlement's work from moral uplift to social change. Kelley's investigations of sweatshop conditions led to the passage of landmark Illinois labor legislation and got her appointed as the state's first factory inspector. She and Addams then published a comprehensive social survey of the Hull House neighborhood. This was an effort to make an unassailable case for tenement reform. While they were laboring in the slums, the White City opened to tremendous national fanfare. The fair took place at a critical juncture in the nation's history. Many Americans saw their country's future bound up with the future of its industrial cities, and these cities appeared to be flying apart. These Americans feared that the unsettling changes urban growth had brought with it, socialism and labor unrest, spreading slums, waves of Catholic and Jewish immigrants, and a new and freer morality, were tearing apart the old Protestant republic. A young American historian raised a further concern. In an essay he read at a meeting of historians at the Chicago Fair called The Significance of the Frontier in American History, Frederick Jackson Turner announced the closing of the frontier of free land, the nurturing source of America's democracy, and a safety valve for urban discontent. Reading Turner's essay gave some people the sense that the country was about to explode. But this was also a decade of confidence, and Daniel Burnham's White City was a reassuring expression of faith in the nation's future. Its message was that cities could be saved, not by settlement workers and socialists, but by civic-minded businessmen. Built by Chicago's commercial kings, the White City was their vision of what a great city could be like. There were no beggars or garish signs, and the streets were immaculately clean. Picturesque walkways and waterways connected the magnificent exhibition halls, and these buildings were filled with the newest inventions of the age, among them electric kitchens, calculating machines, and a gadget for viewing motion pictures, Thomas Edison's kinetoscope. The builder of this place understood the American mind. In Daniel Burnham's city, tradition and change, order and innovation were in perfect harmony, suggesting to anxious Americans that they could enjoy all the conveniences of the machine age without changing their old values and habits. Visitors came away wondering why every American city couldn't be made over in the image of the White City. The writer William Dean Howells called it a glimpse of utopia. The black leader Frederick Douglass pronounced it a national scandal. The White City excluded the accomplishments of African Americans, and when fair directors held a special Colored People's Day, they added a note of ridicule to the occasion by providing watermelons to the crowd. Douglass and his young friend, the black activist Ida B. Wells, wrote a protest pamphlet and passed it out at the fair. But while Wells boycotted Colored People's Day, Douglass, who was 75 and in failing health, used the occasion to give an electrifying speech over the shouts of hecklers. "We Negroes," he said, "love our country. We fought for it. We only ask that we be treated as well as those who fought against it in the Civil War." Douglass pointed to the paramount problem of the White City. It failed to acknowledge not only the accomplishments, but also the existence of the kind of powerless people Hull House workers were trying to help. The White City's richest legacy is the confidence of its builders in the possibilities of urban life. Their conviction that the modern metropolis, with its enormous problems, could be made over into a work of art. But a great city is not a work of inspired scene painting, static and splendid. It's a living drama with a huge and varied cast of characters and with a plot full of conflict, tension, and spectacle. People will always disagree about how to make cities better. Dreiser speaks for those who insist that cities should be allowed to grow freely and naturally, achieving a kind of messy vitality, while Burnham speaks for those who lean toward order and planning. But both Dreiser and Burnham ignore the lesson their own city provided, that a great city is an uneasy balance between order and energy, planning and privatism, capitalism and community, Jane Addams and Philip Arnold. What Dreiser did understand is the meaning of the White City. He loved the fair and took his dying father there in a wheelchair to see it. But he, like most street-smart Chicagoans, saw it for what it was, a summer city, not the real thing. Dreiser took Chicago and later New York for what they were, the good and the bad, and brought them back to us in prose portraits that rival those of the outstanding urban interpreters of the age, Honoré Balzac and Charles Dickens. And he caught the significance of what he witnessed. Chicago was an unequal place to watch what he called a new world in the making.
I think that's significant about how he ends as well, a new world in the making, because really that's what's going on in these decades at the end of the 19th century. A new way of life is being created that had never existed before. And it's really, they were creating the life that we all live today and take for granted, but it was totally new to the people in that age. So we'll begin next with the Gilded Age. When he talked about Thomas Edison's kinetoscope, the image they used was actually incorrect. The kinetoscope was actually a viewer where you had to stand at a box and actually look into it to see the motion picture going on, where the image they showed was actually the Vitascope, which was the first projector that doesn't come about till a little bit after that time, so a few years later. So whoever did the graphics for that was wrong. And when he talked about a building collapsing in a heap if it was a masonry structure more than 10 stories tall, that's actually incorrect as well, because one of the buildings they showed in Chicago is the Monadnock building, which is still there, so it's over 100 years old, and it is made out of bricks. It just has massive foundations in which the first floors of the building are probably something like 15 feet thick of solid brick. All right, this is actually the cover plate from Thomas Edison's book called The Gilded Age. And so, as we've been going over the last several chapters, we talked about society and how you have the elites on top and the working people on the bottom. The working people are the ones who are often doing the labor that's creating all that wealth, but not really participating to the extent that they are actually making even enough money to survive. And we've seen plenty of pictures now in the last few weeks of how the working people, those unskilled immigrants, often immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, live. Remember, there's somewhere around 25 million immigrants to this country between 1870 and 1920. Many only making $1 a day, $1 to $2 a day. But the focus of today's talk is on the 1%, not necessarily the 99%. And this is John Jacob Astor. He was America's first millionaire. Mr. Astor made his fortune initially in the fur trade early in the 19th century. After the War of 1812, the British are banned from trapping animals here in the United States. It was actually a privilege that they were allowed to keep with the Treaty of Paris at the end of the Revolutionary War. It was something that Americans were extremely hostile about in the following decades of how could that be allowed. And finally, when we win the War of 1812, it is negotiated that the British can no longer do that. And it's Mr. Astor who is actually allowed to come in and then buy those furs that are being trapped here in the Midwest, which was considered, by the way, the West. The idea of the West that we would think of, which is the far West, out in California, Nevada, that's at that period of time. If you go in the early 19th century, that's not even America up there. So the West to people in the early 19th century is where we're living. So Mr. Astor makes a huge fortune. Actually has an office up at Mackinac Island where they're buying furs. He's got trappers out trapping animals. He takes the money that he makes from that fortune and actually makes an even larger fortune investing in Manhattan real estate. So we've been hearing a lot about what went on in Chicago, and that real estate boom of the late 19th century. But Manhattan, that real estate has always been expensive in American history for over 200 years. This is an island. There's only limited space, and so it's always been at a premium. And Mr. Astor realized that. So he makes the first great fortune in the country. His grandson, by the time that we're studying in the Gilded Age, is the head of the family. William Blackhouse Astor was his name. And he was married to this woman. Her name was Caroline Schimmelhorn Astor. Caroline Astor was considered to be the queen of New York society. Thanks for closing the door. And she is really responsible for leading society in this time period, really in the East Coast. It's very high school. A lot of what I'm talking about is going to sound a lot like high school now. She's basically the leader of this clique, and she's the one that decides if you are in or you are out. So she will start what's known as the New York 400 with a good friend of hers, Ward McAllister. And they come up with a list of around 400 people, over 200 families that are basically good enough to be on her list and be invited to her parties. So it's all very childish. She has these requirements of how you have to trace your family lineage back a certain number of generations, and it seems all kind of random too, because actually she decides that the Vanderbilt family is not eligible. She considers them to be nouveau riche and too tacky to be on her list, which is somewhat extraordinary, considering their families had made their fortunes around the same time. But so 400 is said to be the number that would fit in her brownstone mansion here on Lower Fifth Avenue, 34th Street and Fifth Avenue. This is actually a photograph taken of it just shortly before it was torn down, and she built the Astoria Hotel. She built the Astoria because it needed to move further uptown where it was more fashionable, because another branch of the family that they did not really talk to or get along with very well had torn down their matching brownstone and built the Waldorf Hotel. And so that even though the two families didn't get along, eventually they combined their business interests and create the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. Yeah. Her name was Caroline Astor. And so I'm glad you asked that, because it's important that you remember her name, Caroline Astor. And so if you haven't written it down, remember that she's the queen of New York society, essentially this elite clique of robber baron families out east. And so she will hire one of the great architects of the day, Richard Morris Hunt, Richard Morris Hunt to build her this French chateau up Fifth Avenue, about 35 blocks north. And it was actually a double house. There were two townhouses. Half of it was hers, and half of it was lived in by her son. William Blackhouse, her husband, dies in 1892, and she builds this house shortly afterwards. Mr. Astor actually did not have any interest in her social pursuits. He would often come home at night and just go straight to his room, not come down to visit with her guests or go to the balls that were being held in the ballroom. He spent most of his time on his yacht and at their country estate in upstate New York called Ferncliff, which the last of the Astor heirs only recently died in about the last 10 years. And Ferncliff now has passed from private hands, and it was given to some nuns, which I think they have a school there today. But and unfortunately, the Astor House in Manhattan was torn down many years ago. But it was a double house. The son, John Jacob Astor IV, and his wife lived in the other half of it. And there's a very large ballroom on the top floor. She actually expands the number of people who are acceptable to her on her New York 400 list after she builds this house, because it's much larger, and now she can triple the size of the 400 list, and now it's 1,200 people that are acceptable. And next picture is actually John Jacob Astor IV, her son, who sadly will die on his honeymoon returning from Europe with his third or fourth wife, who was 19 and he was 49, and she was pregnant with their young son. She will survive, but he goes down with the Titanic. And has anybody ever seen the movie The Titanic? Have you watched it? So he's the guy who, when you see it going down, is sitting in that big lounge, smoking a cigar and drinking a brandy with his butler. And so that's the ballroom at the new Astor Mansion. And it served also as the art gallery, because certainly if you were of this elite status, the house had to be filled with the finest objects, the finest furniture that money could buy, antiques, as well as new pieces that were custom made for the house. And then you were generally expected to collect fine art. And at this time, it's really quite common to buy European paintings, old master paintings. Some people like Marshall Field's wife in Chicago. She actually had a great interest in modern art, and so she was at the forefront of collecting art like from Monet and Van Gogh, which was really considered to be quite out there and kind of crazy art, but she was really smart to do so, because it became even more expensive than some of the other artists that were older, at least at the time. This is the architect who built many of the Gilded Age mansions for these robber barons, Richard Morris Hunt. This is actually a full-length portrait of him that was painted by John Singer Sargent. If you've never heard of John Singer Sargent, he was a great American portrait painter of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And he painted the often women's portraits. He's very famous for painting women's portraits. If you've taken an art history class, you'll study some of those. But he was hired by Vanderbilt, George Washington Vanderbilt, actually to paint this portrait. And it hangs in the grand staircase of George Washington Vanderbilt's country house in Asheville, North Carolina, which I'll show you later on.
What's his name again?
This Richard Morris Hunt. Yeah. And actually, as a young man, he had studied in France and actually worked on extensions of the Louvre Palace that were being built under Napoleon III. So he had very classical training, and therefore he was really into building essentially these mansions that looked like palaces that may have been built 300-400 years earlier. And this is actually, we just saw him, by the way, in the film. Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed the grounds for the World's Fair in Chicago, and Mr. Vanderbilt had a full-length portrait painted of him as well, because he was so happy for the amazing work that they were able to accomplish on his estate. So it was quite an honor, actually, to have something like that done, because you're basically only their employee. So the Vanderbilts were seen kind of as social rivals to the Astors. This is Commodore Vanderbilt. Especially his name is Cornelius Vanderbilt. He's born in the late 1700s. He, as a young man, actually a teenager, he borrows a little bit of money from his parents. They were somewhat successful. He starts a transportation company. He decided that there was a need in Manhattan to have a regular ferry route between Manhattan and Staten Island. And so he begins his transportation business by having a little boat that he was able to purchase, and he transports people from Manhattan to Staten Island and back. And actually that route still exists today. It's the Staten Island Ferry. But he would build that into a massive empire of steamboats and even more importantly, actually railroad companies, dozens of railroad companies eventually, by the time he dies in the 1870s, 72 or 73. But anyway, he founds New York Central Railway, which is considered to be the crown jewel in the Vanderbilt transportation empire. And when he died, he had a fortune of $100 million, which is a fortune today, let alone about 150 years ago. So enormous sum of money. When he died, he actually left the bulk of his fortune to his eldest son, William H. Vanderbilt, seen here. William H. Vanderbilt only survives his father by 9 years. But when he dies, he took his inheritance and builds the Vanderbilt empire into a $200 million inheritance for his children. So quite extraordinary fortune that was made. Any idea of what Mr. Vanderbilt's facial hair is called? Yes?
Horns.
Horns, it does look like horns. I like that. I hadn't heard that one before. No, never heard of it. Actually, there's different names for things like this. And so this is mutton chops. That's what he has. Facial hair actually is extremely popular in the decades after the Civil War because so many millions of men fought in the Civil War and, of course, didn't shave for months and years on end. And when the war was over with, they came home and they were like, I like it. I'm going to keep my beard. And so it was quite fashionable to have all kinds of different beards at that time. So anyway, maybe some of you guys can start a fad where this will be the style again. Or maybe not. The Vanderbilts believed in leaving their fortunes to their eldest child. Although I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. This is a photograph of Fifth Avenue in New York City in the around 1880, and maybe this would have to be about 1884, 1885, because Le Petit Chateau, which is the name of this Vanderbilt mansion, is already built. This is William H. Vanderbilt's mansion. It took up an entire city block on Fifth Avenue. It's actually 3 houses. It's the main mansion is for his William H. and his wife, and then the other 2 parts of the house are actually mansions in their own right. They're townhouses that were built for 2 of his married daughters when they were in town. And then their second oldest son actually lived here with his wife. This house was built for William K. Vanderbilt and his wife, Alva Smith Vanderbilt. Alva Smith of the Mobile, Alabama. That's where she was originally from. She was very much interested in society, very much like Caroline Astor, and they were kind of competing with each other. Alva Vanderbilt and her husband built this house essentially to show that the Vanderbilts have arrived and that the Astors need to socially deal with them. So when this house was built, they had an enormous housewarming party. So if you've been reading now in this chapter on the Gilded Age, they talk about this party, and they talk about Alva Vanderbilt and this very expensive party. Now there's conflicting statistics about how much this party cost. Some statistics, some people write that it costs $75,000 for this housewarming party. Others will write that it costs somewhere around $250,000. I think the party itself actually did cost somewhere around $75,000. But as far as the infusion into New York's economy relating to what the guests spent preparing to go to this party, then it was something like $250,000. If you add everything up, the elaborate costumes that were being purchased, I think the jewelry that was purchased as well. So this party was held to open the house, and the flowers are said to have cost $10,000 alone to decorate the enormous mansion. The mansion cost $3 million to build in the early 1880s. And when Mr. and Mrs. Vanderbilt opened their house for their big ball that they had, they initially did not invite Caroline Astor because, of course, they were considered to be tacky, new rich people and not worthy to be on the New York 400 list. But the Astors had a teenage daughter, and many of the young daughter's friends were invited to the ball, and she was not. And the story goes that she was very upset about this, and therefore her mother had to change her ways in order to get the daughter invited to this very important party. So Mrs. Astor writes a note and sends it over to Mrs. Vanderbilt with being hand-delivered by their liveried servant who wore the Astor green velvet outfit. If you don't know what a livery servant is, it would be a personal servant who would attend you in the house like a footman, and he would travel with you, often standing on the back of the coach or perhaps up front with the driver, and a way to display your prominence that you have these servants dressed so elegantly as you travel. And so her servant delivers that Mrs. Vanderbilt writes a note and sends it back to the Astor Mansion with her livery servant dressed in the Vanderbilt maroon livery, velvet livery, and the women agree to meet, and therefore they are now introduced to each other. Mrs. Astor begins to include the Vanderbilts on the 400 list, and now the Astors are invited to this party. And the young daughter, who is so upset, gets to go to this ball, which lasts, of course, until dawn. These parties often did not start till 10 or 11 o'clock at night. It would be an enormous meal. Families like this tended to hire very important chefs. The Vanderbilts, for instance, had a French chef that they paid $25,000 a year to prepare their meals. The President of the United States made $25,000 a year in those days. This was just another status symbol that you could have the finest, one of the finest chefs in the world who was making your meals. And you always made sure that everybody knew how much you were paying for things, which is often considered to be quite tacky, I think, today, but apparently not if you have millions. This is just a view of some of the interior photographs of the William H. Vanderbilt's house. Quite an extraordinary, actually his library. The interiors were all done by Christian Herder, which was one of the great designers of the age. Mr. Vanderbilt's library table considered to be a really fine piece of craftsmanship by the Herder brothers. And Gustav and Christian Herder were extremely talented. And that table actually resides in the Metropolitan Museum of Art today. It's all constructed with very fine, rare woods and inlaid in mother of pearl, which you can see here, the globe, and actually the tabletop has stars in it as well. It's said that the stars depict the sky on the evening of little Mr. Vanderbilt's birth. So, quite extraordinary piece of craftsmanship. Dining rooms. Unfortunately, all the Vanderbilt mansions that we just saw in that previous photograph were right here. Actually, the Petit Chateau was right there. This entire block right here was William H. Vanderbilt mansion. And it was all torn down to build additions onto the Rockefeller Center complex in the late 1940s. And where the front door was is where the famous bronze statue of Atlas sits today. When William H. Vanderbilt dies, he was going to leave the bulk of the $200 million Vanderbilt fortune to his eldest son, Cornelius II, who was named for his grandfather. But it was because of the daughter-in-law, Alva, married to the second oldest son, that she convinces him to split the bulk of the fortune and leave it to the two eldest sons. And then the other 6 grandchildren would only get a small inheritance, because otherwise Alva and William K. would have only gotten a small inheritance. And therefore, I'm sure she was wondering, how could they survive? So do you want to know what a small inheritance was?
Yes, and it wasn't. It's not what we think of today.
It is not what we think of today, right? Yeah. So, anyway, it was like, okay, so to give you an idea, $5 million in trust, the income on a $5 million trust fund, $1 million when the grandfather died in cash, and another $1 million in cash when the father died. So essentially a $7 million inheritance is what the lesser children or grandchildren would have received. And then so the bulk, so there were 6 children that received that. So, and then the other 2 would have received then what was left. So what's 6 times 7? 42. So essentially 42 million in total is although $1 million was from the grandfather, so that's 6 times 6, 36 million actually, and then the rest of the $200 million went to the two oldest. So that's quite a significant difference. But nevertheless, you weren't going to starve to death if you had $7 million. Cornelius built this French chateau on Fifth Avenue, just a few blocks from his father and mother and brother, and two of his sisters. And this is the house, of course, you would live in when you're in town. Of course, Mr. Vanderbilt, after his father dies, and grandfather died first, father dies next, and then he takes over running the Vanderbilt railroad empire, along with his brother William K. But William K., I've read, was not as involved as Cornelius. Unfortunately, Cornelius would die quite young, probably from the stress of running the vast empire. This house was built by another Gilded Age architect named George B. Post. Unfortunately, so many of these mansions have been torn down, so you have to go to museums today to actually see what some of the interiors looked like. This is actually a fireplace that came from the entrance hall of that Vanderbilt mansion. Here's William K. Vanderbilt, who was married to Elva that I told you about, their housewarming party in 1883 that cost $75,000. This is her actually dressed for that party. She's dressed as a Venetian princess because it was very popular during the Gilded Age that you would have a theme whenever you had a party, that there would be some type of a theme that your guests should come dressed as, and for these costume balls that you have. And so that you would wear these elaborate costumes. It would often take weeks, if not months, to prepare if you're giving the party, and then for your guests to be prepared for the party as well, because you would have to have a custom-made costume that would have to be really over-the-top, elaborate. Everything's made by hand with the finest fabrics, and you would have, for the women, of course, you would also have to have the right jewels to wear. Oftentimes, your guests were presented with jewelry. There's one Gilded Age party where all the women received a diamond bracelet. So here's a better picture of William K. and Elva's mansion on Fifth Avenue, Le Petit Chateau, as it was named. Of course, gone today. Interior photograph of it. At that party, Cornelius II and his wife Louise were photographed. I guess that there was always a photographer who would photograph the guests, both as couples or individually or in big groups. And so this is the portrait taken of all of them. Cornelius came as Louis XVI of France, and Louise came as actually Electra. Electra commemorating or celebrating Thomas Edison's introduction of electricity to the island of Manhattan. This is at the time that he's building Pearl Street Station, the first DC power plant in the country to electrify Lower Manhattan. The Vanderbilts, the Morgans, many of these wealthy New York families are actually financing the construction of the first urban power plant to provide electricity for homes, and so she comes as Electra, and the dress survives still today. Here in the bodice is embroidered in silver thread electric lightning bolts, actually. So the architect of the house was, again, Hunt, Richard Morris Hunt, and he was invited. He came as his one of his favorite artists, the Italian old master Cimabue. And Mr. Hunt was very busy towards the end of his career, as he's aging in the 1880s and 90s. He was the top of the list for the robber barons to build mansions. And often these mansions were not their primary residence in town. This, for instance, is the cottage of William K. Vanderbilt and Alva Vanderbilt. It's in Newport, Rhode Island. So Newport, Rhode Island was the most fashionable place to summer during the Gilded Age. So, how many of you have heard of the Hamptons? So today, the most fashionable place to go if you live out east would be to the Hamptons. And if you have the money, then to buy a huge house out there where you can go on the weekends and party. Well, in those days, it was Newport, Rhode Island. So if you're going to build in Newport, it's not a place where you just want to go to get away from it all, but actually where you're going to be really busy because you're going to be holding parties. It's not all summer, by the way. It's going to be at the longest extent during the Gilded Age, because initially it's only a few weeks, about 3 weeks, and then it goes to 4, and eventually it goes to 6 weeks for the Newport, what was called the season, the summer season. So you would only use your house for a maximum of 6 weeks in this period between the end of the Civil War and World War I. And these houses cost as much as your house in town, and sometimes more. So, so this cottage, which is called Marble House, cost $11 million, and you're going to use it for 6 weeks out of the year. It's the basis of its design is actually the Petit Tirano at the Palace of Versailles, which was a favorite kind of getaway cottage on the grounds of the palace of Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France in the 18th century. And so Mrs. Vanderbilt was given this $11 million cottage for her 39th birthday when it was complete in 1892. The bronze gates actually are shown at the 1893 World's Fair. They're considered to be a masterpiece of craftsmanship, and I can show you that picture in a moment. Cornelius, the older brother who runs the Vanderbilt Empire, actually lives next door in this house that he built, or he bought, for $400,000. Not quite the prestigious mansion that you need to own now, as people want to get showier and showier during the Gilded Age. Fortunately, it burns down on Christmas Day of 1892, and Hunt will be hired to produce drawings for a new mansion for Cornelius II and Louise. And these were the two choices that they got. They could have a French chateau, or they could have an Italian palazzo. And the Vanderbilts choose the Italian. Cornelius and Louise choose the palazzo. And so next door is his brother with the French Petit Tirano, known as Marble House. And here is the New Breakers. That's the name of this mansion. Both of those houses, by the way, are museums. And so if you ever get a chance to go to Newport, Rhode Island, you can tour this house. It's owned by the Newport Historical Society. These houses, by the way, are about 100 rooms, 80 to 100 rooms on average for the houses all along Ochre Point, which is where all this development was being done in the 1880s and 1890s. So, yeah.
What would be the point of having like a 100-room house? Like, even if you're not having parties all the time, you would have like 100 rooms.
So what's the point of buying an expensive sports car or the biggest TV that you can buy? It's just because you want it and because you can show off that you can afford it. And so it's all about showing off is what it's about. It's this same kind of thing nowadays, like go out to drive down Lakeshore Drive in some of those houses, you know. So So this is a few photographs just of what the breakers looked like inside, and then I'll show you some pictures of what Marble House looked like inside. So this is the main entry hall of the breakers. And the breakfast room, the dining room, the chandeliers. There's two matching Baccarat, so French crystal Baccarat crystal, they're 12 feet tall, just these chandeliers. The ceiling was imported from a palace in Europe. These are marble columns that are all monoliths, one massive piece of marble. When Hunt designed this house and other and Marble House and other mansions for the robber barons, often you would have the firm of Allard and Sons or Allard and Fee in Paris design the interiors. And the rooms were actually created in the workshops in Paris and then disassembled, numbered and disassembled, shipped here to America with a crew of French craftsmen who built the rooms and then would reassemble them in the spaces for which they were designed. What would that cost? This house cost $12 million. So it actually cost $1 million more than his brother's because it had to be better than Marble House. It had to cost more than Marble House because Cornelius was the oldest son and the patriarch now of the family. He runs the transportation empire, and therefore he has to show that he has the most money and the most prestige. He actually would come up on the weekend on the train, of course. He owns the train network. Comes up on the train every weekend. His wife and his children would spend the season here at the house, but he, of course, had to work, and so he would go home during the week and come up on Fridays. Mr. Vanderbilt's library. Oh, the loggia. A loggia is just simply an arcaded covered area that connects the house. You can see it from the outside here, there. And so you could have your tea, say, in the afternoon, or sit out there and overlook the ocean because Newport is on the Atlantic, and so these houses are all built out on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic. This is the music room, because you have to have a music room in your cottage, and the best musicians of the day, the top opera singers or pianists, whoever was in vogue at the time, would be hired to provide entertainment for your guests. Very late in the evening, the men could go up to the billiard room and play pool, billiards, and smoke their cigars and drink brandy. And then we'll move on to Marble House. So these are the gates. They weigh many tons, but even though they're so heavy, they are perfectly balanced. So it's not hard at all to open the doors, and actually they still use them today. I've been there for a tour and entered through those doors, and it's actually not difficult at all. They were considered to be a masterpiece in bronze casting and then gilding. This is ormolu. Ormolu is when you fire gold onto bronze, and it's actually not done anymore. You can't do it anymore because you have to use mercury for the process, and people who did that had very short lifespans because they were being poisoned by the mercury. The entry hall at Marble House is covered in sienna marble, yellow sienna marble that was imported from Italy. The dining room was covered in this pink or rose-colored Numidian marble that was imported from North Africa. Again, these rooms are all being designed by Allard and Sons in Paris, and the furniture is specially made for these rooms here in Marble House, but the chairs are actually bronze and covered in ormolu. The chairs are so heavy that you cannot get in or out of them by yourself. And one of those liveried servants that I was telling you about would be attending. There would be several of them, and they would be standing and waiting if they were needed in the dining room during a big party to help you in and out of your chair throughout the evening, because these dinners could last 2 or 3 hours easily before you would go across the hall to dance in the ballroom after dinner. And that might not be till 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, and then you would dance until dawn and then go home. And so here's the gold ballroom at Marble House. Upstairs was or is Mrs. Vanderbilt's bedroom. These great houses always had separate suites for the owners. It was common in great houses of Europe to have separate bedrooms for the man and the woman of the house, and that was a tradition in these great houses that was carried on when they were built here in America in the 19th century. The President's house, when it was built in the 18th century, the White House, what we call it today, was built like that. There was always a separate bedroom for the President and the First Lady, and it was only well into the 20th century that they got rid of that tradition in which you have the President and First Lady in the 1970s started to share a bedroom like normal people do, I guess. But although actually I heard that they don't do that now. This is William Kay's library at Marble House. Oh, actually, there was a little story I have about Mrs. Vanderbilt. So I took a class at Newport through the Victorian Society in America a few years ago. It was run by Richard Guy Wilson. Mr. Wilson is considered to be the top architectural historian in the country, and he worked for over 50 years at the University of Virginia. He got his PhD from the University of Michigan in architectural history. And in that class, it was a 10-day course in which you study these houses. You have special lectures and tours by curators and museum professionals from the top museums in the country. And the curator was taking my class through this room, and he said that it had recently been restored because all the silk that had been produced in the 19th century, silk is of course extremely fragile, and by that time the house was well over 100 years old. And it was literally, if you've ever seen silk as it gets old, it like turns, basically just completely falls apart. And so they had to redo it all, but Allard and Sons is still in business. So what they did is they just had them get the drawings out again and get the plans, and they just rewove everything just like it had been. So if you were to go there, it looks exactly the same as it would have in the 1890s. But when they were taking down all the silk hangings, the silk fabric on the walls, they found it was written by the French craftsman on one of the walls. It said the Den of the Viper, because apparently they did not like Mrs. Vanderbilt for whatever reason. She was probably a very difficult client to deal with. And so I thought that was always an interesting thing that these poor workmen were, trying to do the best that they could. They created these beautiful spaces, and Mrs. Vanderbilt must have been not so nice to them. So here's the Gothic library in Marble House. And the first time I went to Marble House, actually, unfortunately, the stained glass was gone after the Vanderbilts died, and another millionaire bought the house. He didn't like them, and they were taken out. But fortunately, they they were put into some other building somewhere in the country, and they eventually were able to get them back. But William K. and Elva had a daughter. Her name was Consuelo. And this is Consuelo. Consuelo was given a proposal of marriage in Mr. Vanderbilt's Gothic Library on the evening of her debutante ball. It was her coming out party in which she was introduced to society. When you reach the age of 16, young women of that elite status would be given have a special party in which now their parents are saying they are eligible to essentially date and find a husband. And if you lived in the Gilded Age and you had this kind of money, the people at that time were very interested in marrying off their children to aristocratic families in Europe. So their daughters were seen as a great prize in which they could marry them off to dukes and earls and marquises and barons, and so that their daughters would become titled aristocrats. Consuelo only met the Duke of Marlborough. This is the Duke of Marlborough when he came to visit that summer, and they didn't even know each other, but he was from one of the most prestigious, oldest families in England, who had lots of titles, lots of land, some really amazing houses, but not lots of money, because a lot of times these old families don't do anything for hundreds of years, and they sort of waste their money. With the Industrial Revolution, the price of grain drops dramatically in the late 19th century with the opening of the Midwest and the Great Plains. All that wheat that now can be harvested meant that the price of grain is dropping, and many of these title families in England actually depended on the income from their huge estates, where they would have tenant farmers, much like the sharecropping system in the South was going on in Europe. And so people like him come to America to meet these heiresses, and with the intention that they will get a large endowment by marrying these girls, which of course they did. And so Consuelo is horrified when she finds out of her mother's plans, and she refuses his hand in marriage, and her mother's determined, though, of course, by this painting, as you can see, that she will marry him. And so Consuelo says, "No, I won't," and her mother locks her in her bedroom, sort of like Cinderella, and says, "You can never come out again until you agree to marry him." And so she does marry him, and they will move to England. They have 2 children. This is actually a painting by John Singer Sargent of the family. Consuelo is now the Duchess of Marlborough, and they moved to London to live in their townhouse that her father builds, and then to the Marlborough country estate known as Blenheim Palace. It's one of the largest houses in all of England. It's about 300 rooms. The dining room is as big as E building, at least as big as E building. It has a table nearly as long, just like you see in those movies sometimes, where people sit at one end and the other, which is often not the case. They often just sat next to each other in real life. But in this case, when I actually took this picture, I went to Blenheim Palace several years ago because I wanted to see where she lived, and she hated him, and so she sat at one end of the table at dinner every night, and he had sat at the other. And there was an enormous silver vase or urn that's still in the room, about probably taller than me, this big around, and she would have it placed in the center of the dining room table so she didn't have to look at his face. So it was very sad. They were married for 19 years. This is the part of the dowry that they had. Her father gave several $1 million, built this house for them in London to live in. But unfortunately, they were never happy together. And eventually Consuelo will follow her mother's footsteps and divorce her husband. and move back to America, at least for part of the time, and marry her high school sweetheart. So I mentioned that Alva, who had been the favorite daughter-in-law of William H. Vanderbilt, who had convinced him to leave the bulk of the family fortune not to Cornelius, but split it between her husband, who was the second oldest. Only 3 years after Marble House was given to Alva as her 39th birthday present, she divorces William K. to marry his best friend who lived in this house across the street, Belcourt Castle. His best friend's name was Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont. Oliver Hazard Perry, of course, the famous naval officer who won the Battle of Lake Erie in the War of 1812. So Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont, his ancestor had been the Commodore. From the Belmont family, who made their fortune in the Rothschild Bank. And how many of you have heard of the Belmont Stakes? Do you know the Belmont Stakes? Part of the Triple Crown. You have the, what's the one in Kentucky? It's the Kentucky Derby, and then there's another one. Preakness, and then the Belmont Stakes. So, Belmont Stakes, this guy right here. He loved horses. And actually, he loved horses so much that the bottom floor of his Newport cottage was the stables for his prized racehorses. He was the most eligible bachelor on the East Coast in the 1890s. He had inherited a fortune of $60 million. And when he marries Alva Vanderbilt, and she moves across the street to Belcourt Palace, or Belcourt Castle, she says she's not going to live above the stables. So they get moved out, and she makes a ballroom down there. And but she doesn't like the laundry facilities at this house, and so she continues to have her laundry done by the servants because she still keeps Marble House. That was part of her settlement, is that she kept Marble House when she divorces Mr. Vanderbilt. It was actually, so anyone have an idea of how divorce was looked upon in the 19th century? Ever hear a story about divorce in the 19th century? Well, if you were a woman in the 19th century and you got divorced, that was generally the end of you. Like, your friends would not associate with you. People thought that you were a tainted woman and that you were just a terrible person. And Alva Vanderbilt actually changes that whole perception because because of her strong will. She actually initially thought that getting divorced would not hurt her. It sort of did in the beginning, but the whole story about her daughter and the Duke of Marlborough changed all of that. Everyone had wanted to meet the Duke of Marlborough, and so that brought her back into the fold of elite society. So she was never ostracized. Many women of that time who were married to these robber barons, if they were divorced, they could never re-enter society. No one would want to come to their parties. And but Alva was quite different. So she really changes that perception of divorce for women of that status during that age. And so that's quite significant. She was very much in favor of women's suffrage as well. And she will spend her later years using her wealth and her influence to help bring attention to the plight of women not having the right to vote. And so that's important as well. But anyway, this is what one of the rooms in Belcourt Castle looks like today. It actually was recently restored by a young woman who made an enormous fortune in selling costume jewelry online. So here's a photograph of Alva on the right and Consuelo on the left. Later in both their lives, Consuelo by this time had divorced the Duke and married her high school sweetheart. She really did have a very long neck. You know, in that painting that I showed you earlier, it often looked like, they exaggerate things. But that was okay because if you do have a very long neck, historically it was considered to be a great sign of beauty. So, and here they are actually at a rally that Alva is holding in order to help get women the vote. Alva actually built this tea house at Marble House later on, and she would use it to have fundraisers for women's suffrage. And so if you go to Newport, you can actually see the restored tea house that she built. Mr. Belmont only dies after about 10 or 11 years of marriage. He dies unexpectedly, and Alva, of course, was quite distraught. And she begins to use Marble House more often now after he dies. So, although Mr. Belmont was really not the most upstanding person. I was reading about him about a year ago, and he was married to a young woman that his parents didn't really want him to marry, and he pursued her endlessly. I don't think her parents wanted him to marry her either, but eventually she agrees. His parents agree, and so they have this huge wedding, as people like that, of course, would, and then they go off on the grand tour of Europe, and they go to Paris, and they said that after about 5 or 6 weeks of their honeymoon, because usually if you did the grand tour, it could last anywhere from 3, 4, 6 months, a year even, as you travel around Europe. And they made an agreement with the bride's parents, or at least her mother, that then they would come to visit them and stay in Paris with them for a while. And her mother gets there, and I guess he wasn't very happy with her mother or her or the bride, and he just never comes home one night, and he just abandons her on their honeymoon. And they eventually get a divorce. She was pregnant with their child. He never even wants to have anything to do with the young child either. So, sort of a weird story about Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont. So, but by the turn of the century, he has died, and Alva is now a widow, and she'll build one last house. So, she still has Marble House. She has this house. This is actually out on Long Island. She has a chateau in France as well. She's actually buried in the chapel at this chateau in France. It's not unusual if you have this robber baron money at the time. Remember, there's no income tax. That's not going to happen until the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, which is ratified in 1913. So you're paying no income tax, no federal income tax. And that meant that these families, for decades, if they had money, were able to amass enormous sums of money. And so, which means that some of these families out on the East Coast have really not had to do very much in over 100 years, because they're still living off these massive fortunes that were accumulated in all those decades that before you pay taxes. So even once the time comes that you have to start paying taxes, there were literally hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars, essentially in our money, that you never pay taxes on, so, which has been in investments and accounts ever since then. So, but it's very common to have several houses. Many families had a townhouse in Paris as well, because the women often went to Paris to have their clothing designed in this period. They certainly had yachts. It was common to have a house in the mountains as well, so in which you would go. There was a season in the mountains. Many families had houses in a development called Tuxedo Park in upstate New York, and where the women and the men could dress less formally. The women could actually wear the gowns that they had worn during the Newport season, or earlier during the winter season, when it was the opera season in the months after Christmas. They could wear them a second time, and because generally you're not, for a woman, you could not wear the same dress twice, so to an event, and so wear it once and that was about it. And then for a man, that even us guys have it easy today. You can wear the same thing over and over and nobody's going to care. So guys wore more formal tails, though, in those days. Tuxedo Park actually was a less formal suit that became known as the tuxedo. And it was said that it was developed for the season in the fall, where you would go to your mountain house and the men might go hunting in the fall. So, and then in the evening, the women would wear their old dress. You know, they had worn it already once, and you could wear it a second time. So it's all kind of crazy, crazy lifestyle that the robber barons lived at that time. But remember, this was a time when the top 1% of the nation owned as much property as the bottom 50%, and that top 1% had as much income as the 99% below them. So, extraordinary way that they lived. And of course, it didn't last. The Great Depression came along in the 1930s. Income tax had come along in 1913. Families had to divide. Most families divided their fortunes between their children and grandchildren, so great fortunes were divided up. And oftentimes, these great houses could not be saved, or they were given to charities. So they became schools, or monasteries, or convents, or were just torn down. And actually, you can even see that here in Detroit, although the fortunes in Detroit were made a bit later, towards the end of the Gilded Age. But nevertheless, the great mansions that were built down in Detroit and on Lakeshore Drive only lasted for about a generation, and for the most part torn down. And even though there are some really nice big houses on Lakeshore, the great 100-room mansions that used to be there, for the most part, are all gone now. All right, so that's the Gilded Age. Hopefully, it told you about a time in our history that you've probably never heard of. Enjoy your weekend.
Good luck with today's lesson.